Hey there, thanks for tuning into Duck Bricks. I'm Chris, aka the Brick Archivist, and today we are starting a brand new series, taking a look at LEGO construction themes throughout the years. From Bionicle to Hero Factory and everything in between, including Galador and Knight's Kingdom, there have been a surprisingly high amount of LEGO construction and action figure themes, and this is the channel where you can see them all. But I knew I couldn't go on this journey alone, and that's why I've recruited a guest host along the way. So please welcome LEGO David, conferencing in all the way from Romania, where we're going to be discussing all sorts of construction themes. Today, we're going to be taking a look at what came before Bionicle, in the time before time, where there were Slicers and Robo Riders. And we're even going to be looking at some of the unique Bionicle concepts like voodoo heads and stuff like that. So we've got a very exciting episode planned, and so let's dive on in, and thank you all for listening. For those of you who may not be familiar with LEGO David, he is a certified LEGO construction expert, and he knows everything there is to know about LEGO construction. So, thanks for being here, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, thank you again for being here. I guess we can get started with you kind of recapping for both the audience and myself your journey with LEGO, what types of LEGO that you really like, and what specifically draws you to LEGO as a whole.
So, I'm a LEGO fan in general. I like pretty much everything LEGO, being that system, technique, construction. I like everything LEGO. And that's because each and every of those is good in its own way. Like, system is good for building buildings, landscapes and such. Technique is good for building large-scale, detailed cars, vehicles and such. And construction is good for building action figures. Each of those systems is good for something of its own. And sure, you can build maybe an action figure with system pieces, but I'm not sure it's as efficient because, let's face it, what looks better, a pre-molded mask or a brick-built mask?
Yup, and I think the other thing that construction really has above, say, building a system mech is the price, because obviously you can build a very impressive mech with system, as we've seen with the recent Monkey Kid sets, but then that mech's $150. And if you put it next to a Bionicle Titan, they're about the same height, potentially about the same outward bulk, and the Bionicle Titan's going to be like $25.
Yeah, I 100% agree. It feels like LEGO kind of forgot what made construction so popular to begin with. Like, it began all the way back in 1999 with the Slicers, and those guys were like $6, like pocket money. It's unbelievable looking back now. If I'm a kid and I have $5 or $6 and I go to a LEGO store now, I can only buy like some dots bracelet, that's about it. In $9.99 you can actually buy an entire slicer, cute little robot, you have those big containers where you can put the discs, you can shoot, lots of fun. And you can buy more of them because they're so cheap.
I would definitely agree, and to kind of circle back to your point about construction almost losing its way, I think I definitely agree because if you look at the 2017 Star Wars construction sets, for example, the cheapest one is around $25 to $30, which really isn't pocket change for any kid, and $6 in 1999, which could get you basically one figure, adjusted for inflation is around $9 to $10 today. So even with adjusting for inflation, you can still see the amount of value that you could get back then as compared with now. And of course the parts are bigger, you get a bigger figure with $25, it's more complete, but I feel like they're missing that niche of having a really cheap set to go with it. And that's kind of what led to the downfall, I feel, a bit to construction. But I guess we can talk about that in a future episode. And now that we're on the topic of early construction, why don't we transition to what came before Bionicle?
Yeah, but first off, I want to point out how construction actually began. So originally, the first concept ever for a construction theme came back all the way back in 1995.
Oh yeah, Cybots, right?
Cybots, yes. Another one of those Christian Faber concept arts. From what I can see, it looks like it was supposed to be like similar to Galador. There's a lot of pre-molded parts and mixed with a bit old system.
Yeah, the system torsos are pretty fascinating to me because it seems that they could even use the torsos for slapping on legs or even just putting wheels and other stuff on them. And I'd be really curious to see kind of what a blend between what system and construction would be like today.
Yeah, I'm really curious what the line would have looked like if it got released. Those Cybots looks like a pretty interesting concept. I for one would be definitely down for seeing this concept revisited maybe with modern CCBS or something. I think it has potential.
For sure, and I mean a lot of the big discussions in the Bionicle and construction community as a whole is trying to figure out how to make construction viable in today's era. And it seems that a lot of kids are really into system, and this kind of makes me think, how could melding construction and system actually look like in today's modern world. And I think it's kind of an interesting concept to explore. Obviously, we know that LEGO's humanoid figures are pretty hit or miss. Even the Star Wars ones looked really strange when they weren't wearing helmets. So I'd be curious to see kind of what they could come up with the just basic design prompt of mixed system and construction to make a fully fledged and relatively cohesive product.
I don't know exactly what happened with Cybots. Probably it didn't got approved. Maybe they did some product testing and kids didn't like them, or maybe they just didn't think it would do well, so they decided to expand upon the concept in a different way, which would become the 1999 line known as Slicers or Trobots,
yes.
Even though Slicers is a better name.
Oh yeah.
Like, Trobots sounds kind of lame to me. Slicers is a lot more interesting.
I agree. Throwbots is kind of a silly name.
Yeah. The late 90s and early 2000s was a bit of a silly time for LEGO, so that's to be expected.
Yeah, and I think that's pretty emblematic in some of these builds. They're a little bit wacky and goofy looking, although the one thing that I really do appreciate is that, unlike Bionicle, both in its early and later years, there aren't really any clone sets. While they do revolve around the same gear function, there's efforts made to make each of them very distinct from each other than just like weapons or different kind of leg configurations like Bionicle. They're pretty radically different from each other. Like, for example, the Fire Slicer is basically the Pohatu of the Slicers with the upside down build. And then we've got the Blaster Slicer, which is the closest thing to a Titan set that you'd see that early. You can see the two sets of ball joints that they still kind of decided to do with the later years of Bionicle. So you can really see the groundwork for what would become Bionicle and Construction as a whole in these sets, which is something I find really interesting.
Overall, this is a really fascinating and interesting line. I know some people don't like it because how the gears, like the whole body is built around the gear function. Mm-hmm. Which, honestly, I don't mind. I think it's a really interesting, and it gives them a really neat kind of junkyard-ish look.
Yeah, and like you said, I really appreciate the aesthetic of these, especially as a part of LEGO history. And the one thing that I can see about the gear function that people might not like is that the amount of rotations that it takes to just spin the head, because you're basically spinning a very, very small gear to turn a very large gear that the head's mounted on. So for kids, I could kind of see why this might be a little frustrating, but honestly, it doesn't bother me too much. And Bionicle would, of course, do it better a few years later, but really this is the very beginning of the evolution of what Construction would become, so I can really appreciate it for that. The other thing that kind of interests me about these is that I know between the two of us, the only one we're missing is Millennium, which is kind of an interesting one, where it was a very prototype early version of a character riding a bike, but then the cool thing about that one is that you could not only have him ride the bike, but you could rebuild him to incorporate parts from the bike to become a large Titan scale set, which is really not something we saw too often in Bionicle, and I'm kind of curious as to why that one's so rare.
Yeah, Millennium, from what I've heard, is more like the rarer one, because on Bricklink he's like $20 compared to the other slices, which are pretty dirt cheap on Bricklink. Like, you can get one for like $3. I feel like that might have been some more limited release, or maybe, I don't know exactly, but it's still a more desirable set and more rare.
And speaking of the popularity of these, I think now that you mentioned that, it's kind of interesting to me how they've had almost a bit of a resurgence in recent years, especially with Machus kind of revamping and remaking these sets, like in the recent Machus collabs.
This line, Sliders, has really grown its fan base over time, because originally they were just kind of forgotten, nobody remembered them, but when people look back and saw it, this was actually the father of Bionicle.
It's really interesting. Now that you say that, I can definitely 100% agree.
Yeah, definitely. Another thing that's really, I think, deserves to be appreciated about Sliders is the beautiful box arts. Like, look at those box arts. They look amazing. And I think especially for 1999, those box arts are really, really nice looking. Because 1999, they still photograph their sets in a real background, like the Ninja line from 1999. So they had those sets and they photographed them on a background that used like real stones and such, which is also nice. But this is the first time they tried actually making more of a artwork as the box art, you know?
I agree, and the other thing that I really appreciate about these is that elements in the box art are not completely hand-drawn. There seem to be some computer-generated imagery or graphics that are going on in the back, especially if you look at the Judge or Jet Slider right here. It's pretty clear to me that the polygons in the background are in some form computer-generated, and then some art is overlaid on top of them, which I feel like really adds to the retro and technological feel of these sets. They're not like placed in a completely realistic environment. There are some digital aspects, which I really do feel helps sell the fact that they are digital creatures or robotic creatures in some form of digitized world.
Yeah, so this is a surprisingly important line for LEGO, and probably a line that LEGO themselves probably don't even remember, yet it pioneered so many interesting things. So I'm really glad it got its fan base. I personally really love them. Like, I love their color schemes, they're really colorful. Like, putting all of them together on a shelf really looks really nice, in my opinion. And it's actually a very consistent aesthetic, something like Bionicle I feel in later years kind of lost.
Yep, and we'll get into that.
Yeah, and especially they have some really rare colors like teal and purple, especially, that got into Bionicle 2001, but we haven't seen them afterwards at all.
Yeah, teal only very recently made a resurgence after Mark Stafford famously killed it with the Dark Panther in 2008, but we've never actually seen this shade of purple ever again. It's been kind of replaced by a different shade, which is a little bit darker than what this shade is, which is a more lighter purple.
Oh, I forgot to mention about the slicers, the containers, which you had, you could put them on your belt and feel like a true 90s kid.
Ah, yes, they had the belt clips.
But I think that about pretty much wraps up our thoughts on the slicers. What do you think?
And now I think it's time to move on to the next construction, which was Robo Riders.
Oh, yes.
Robo Riders, some people hesitate to call them construction because they're more like technique-based, even though they do use ball joints like Power, the yellow one, uses ball joint. But I think they definitely count because they, first off, they are character builds, come in canisters, and they're like elemental heroes, if I can call them like that.
Yeah.
Which is a trope construction has always used, so I think they definitely count as construction, especially the fact that they were the first sets to ever introduce the canisters.
I agree, and of course any Bionicle fan knows just how important the canisters were to both the story and the collectability aspect of things, so it was kind of interesting to see them appear here first. But I guess the thing about these Robo Rider sets, I have some of them but not all of them. The one thing about Robo Riders to me is that, especially compared to the slicers, they're a lot more similar to each other.
Yeah, but I don't feel exactly like clone sets necessarily. Like, they are built differently, they have different functions, even though they are more samey than the slicers. But they also have like different heads, like some of them use the new Robo Rider headpiece that was introduced, but some of them also still use the slider heads like Onyx, which has a slider head with a different print. Also, one thing to point out is that Frost, the ice one, seems to have something like a Krana as a print on him, if you have noticed.
You know, I have never noticed that before, but now that you say it, I'm actually kind of seeing it near the top there. You can see the kind of mouth of a Krana and the lines stretching out of it. So, kind of an interesting detail in seeing how it's very clear that essentially these same people who worked on Bionicle and developed the Bionicle aesthetic were already kind of playing around with how the look and feel would be with these.
Another interesting thing that they experimented with Robo Riders was the gimmick they had, where you had to put the canisters in a freezer, and then a code would be revealed which would be used on a LEGO website, on lego.com, to play a game of something.
Oh wow, I didn't actually know that that was a feature. I'm gonna have to try that out in my freezer now, and as far as I know, there was nothing story relevant that caused them to be put in the cold to reveal anything. So it's kind of just a weird quirk that these sets had that sets them apart from the other stuff.
They did some really interesting stuff with their packaging around this time. Like, they really tried to make the packaging feel like it was part of the toy instead of being just packaging, you know, like the canisters, slicers, containers, all that kind of stuff. The lids of the canisters actually can be used as actual Lego pieces because they have some pin connection.
Oh wow, I didn't actually know that one.
If you ever get your hands on a full canister, you should try using the lid for something, because it has pin connection, so you can use it as a wheel or something round, I don't know.
Was this feature actually ever advertised?
They had combo models for both the Slicer and the Robo Riders, and you needed to use those lids as wheels for the combo models.
Huh, I'm looking at those now, and these are actually kind of making me want to buy the rest of the Robo Riders and get them with the canisters, because those are some pretty inventive uses of what's essentially a large cylinder. And I kind of want to try building at least some of these for my own collection. I mean, now that you bring this up, I'm curious, do you know if canister pieces were ever used as part of builds or had any other function other than canisters? I know the 2001 Bionicle lids functioned as mask suvas, because you could stick the masks onto them, and then the 2004 Toa Metru lids were actually the Matoran pods that Duma used to store the Matoran of Metru Nui, but nothing that really integrated them fully into builds kind of like this.
They did use the Bionicle 2001 canister lids for some board games. They had some Bionicle board games, and they
Yes.
included some of those lids as something for the board game, but I'm not exactly sure how that worked. I just saw some pictures online.
Yeah, same here. I know Bionicle had a very early trading card game and a board game, but never actually have gotten the chance to get my hands on it, so I don't actually know how that works or how it was set up.
Yeah, speaking of which, I think it's about time we could transition into what arguably saved the company, Bionicle 2001.
Let's do it, and since this video is on the precursors to Bionicle, let's shift our attention to the prototype Bionicle sets, or what came before. For context for viewers who might not be familiar with this, Bionicle's name was of course not originally Bionicle. In fact, they cycled through a variety of working names, going from Boneheads of Voodoo Island to Voodoo Heads and then just Do Heads, before settling on Bionicle or Biological Chronicle, which was quite different from those first two names. What's super interesting to me is that Christian Faber, who was one of the heads of the direction of the art and lore of Bionicle, posted some videos of the toy prototypes of the Voodoo Heads concept models dated back to 1999, so 2 years before Bionicle would officially release. It's kind of interesting to me to see how similar and yet how different these are from what we eventually got.
I think it was a really interesting idea, and I don't know if it would have been better to go to this direction, because obviously Voodoo sounds kind of like a weird thing to use in a toy line, but would have liked to see more like big Technic figures instead of just Toa. Like we can see up on screen, we have those more Technic figures. They aren't necessarily like the Toa Mata where they are more simplified. They look more complex.
I agree. The one thing that really stands out to me about these prototypes is just the sheer amount of creativity that goes into creating each figure and each function. It's kind of interesting seeing how some of these functions would sort of get integrated into Rahi. Some of them were never seen at all, especially like this punching one right here. And they even had some motorized action that we'd eventually see in the Manas, but this almost kind of looks like a Boxor to me in the way that it's walking. So overall, just really interesting stuff, and I guess the other big differentiating factor to these guys are the heads, of course.
And they also have these unique looking mask things, which I think could have been interesting.
Yeah, it's just super fascinating overall to me to see kind of what's similar to Bionicle in many aspects. Like, for instance, this model here is basically the same exact function as the Moaka and Kane Ra, although I don't know if I maybe even prefer this color scheme a little bit more. It's kind of a little bit more striking. But yeah, the other thing that's interesting about these is that they put the heads on the top of the canisters, and of course on the top of the Bionicle canisters there is a slot for the masks, but they didn't actually put it on for when it was on display.
That would have been interesting.
And I guess to kind of wrap things up in this regard, I will say that in terms of the masks, I am actually quite glad that we got what we got with Bionicle. While these are kind of interesting, I feel like there's not really too much that you can do with them.
And the masks actually have more versatility. They can be used as other things other than just heads. They can be used as armoring and such.
I think you've pretty much hit the nail on the head there. That is really the strength of Bionicle, because not only could you use different colors of masks as different characters, but as you said, you could use the masks as armor. Even official sets used faces and masks for Bionicle as armor, shoulder pieces, and whatnot. So pretty versatile things that we could do with the masks there, and that's why I really do appreciate the masks that we got. And while these heads are kind of interesting, they're more like Mixel faces to me than Bionicle masks, which is of course an interesting aesthetic, but I'm glad Bionicle went the way they did. But I guess with that about wraps up our look at all of the precursors to Bionicle, from Throwbots/Slicers to Robo Riders, and even the explorations with Voodoo Heads. LEGO came actually a long way in just these very early years of developing Construction, and I'm very excited to continue this talk with you next time when we will reconvene to discuss the golden years of Bionicle, that being 2001 to 2003. So thank you again, David, for coming on and conferencing in from a very, very different time zone than mine. I think we're 10 hours apart. So thank you so much for doing this, and I'll talk to you again very soon. For everyone else listening, stay tuned to DuckBricks for even more LEGO and Bionicle news, reviews, and analyses coming your way very soon. Thanks, and bye-bye for now.